The next region coming in Genshin Impact will be Inazuma, and along with it there'll be many new characters that we'll be able to play as. In our last video we briefly discussed each of the known upcoming characters for Inazuma, but to be honest we didn't really go into Scaramouche all too much. This wasn't because we dislike Scaramouche, rather it was because there wasn't enough time in the video. So in this video I'm going to properly do him justice and speculate his attacks, weapon and elements. The keyword here is speculate. Much like our Baal video, this is going to be mostly educated guesses, but now let's get into it. Well, the easiest things for me to speculate first would be his weapon and his vision element. There have been leaks that he uses a catalyst and has an electrovision. Personally, I'd agree with this, but we can't just outright agree with no reasoning. So let's go through some points that support these leaks. I'll start with his weapon since there isn't as much to speculate with this. So besides the leak there isn't really much to go on. The only bit of evidence to support the catalyst leak is that, as stupid as it sounds, his hat appears to have catalyst-like elements to it. So yeah, not really evidence, but I personally can't think of anything to support any other weapon. You could say that he'll use a sword since they're kind of like katanas which are traditional to Japanese culture, and therefore presumably found in Inazuma quite a lot as well. But this doesn't really make sense for Scaramouche, because he's not from Inazuma, he's from Snezhnaya, so why would he use a traditional Inazuma weapon? After all, Tartaglia has a bow, which isn't hugely traditionally Chinese. But let's quickly look at Tartaglia and his weapon to see if we can get any clue from there. It's said in the game, but I can't remember where, that the reason Tartaglia uses a bow is because it's the weapon he's least confident with. This can be seen in his elemental skill and also his boss battle. His skill switches his weapon into swords, and in his battle there are certain attacks reminiscent of polearms. But would this logic apply to Scaramouche? I'd say that it wouldn't. Scaramouche is said to be incredibly strong and also disliked by even the Harbingers. To me this shows that he wouldn't even bother using a weak weapon, he'll just do what he's good at out of stubbornness. Even if he did use one of his weaker weapons, we still couldn't know what that weapon would be. So while there's little evidence to support it, I'm going to agree with the leak and say that he's going to be a catalyst user. Okay, but now let's move on to his elements. And that is elements plural, since he not only wields a vision, but also a delusion. So the leaks say that he has an electrovision, which would seem to fit his character design. Now forgive me if I'm wrong, but I couldn't find any shot of him in the game where we can outright see a vision. But let's also have a look at his delusion. Unlike his vision, there's no leaks that I could find that outline the element of his delusion. In our last video I spent quite a long time speculating the delusion element, and we came to the conclusion that it would be pyro. But since then I've thought of more evidence to support this fact. It's a bit of a stretch, sure, but a character's element does reflect their personality to a certain extent. So let's look at Electro and see what that might represent. I think that Electro users are quick-witted and cunning and can be very energetic at times. So let's have a look at a few Electro characters that support this. Razor has a lot of wolf aspects such as his quick wit and cunning, Keeching is quick-witted enough to help run a nation, and even Tartaglia, who has an electro delusion, is cunning and tricky. So what about Pyro? I think that Pyro characters are feisty and, well, fiery in personality. A good few examples would be Xinyan, Diluc and Amber. I also think that Pyro could represent anger, but we haven't seen that yet because all of the Pyro characters we've seen so far have been good guys. So both the personalities of Pyro and Electro line up with what we've seen of Scaramouche. He's incredibly cunning and tricky, but he's also short-tempered and prone to anger. Therefore, I'd say that him being both Electro and Pyro does make sense. But enough with his character traits, why don't we give a try at speculating his attacks? Now with these, there's literally nothing that gives any evidence towards his attacks. There's not even any leaks regarding them, so we'll have to make a lot of assumptions. The first is that, like Tartaglia, he won't be able to use his delusion outside of a boss fight. And yes, I do believe that he'll have a boss fight at some point in the Inazuma story. Another thing I'm going to assume from Tartaglia is that Scaramouche will also be able to create an effect similar to Tartaglia's Riptide status. This is an effect laid upon enemies when they're hit with an elemental attack from Tartaglia, and if they're hit again, then the Riptide will cause extra damage. Obviously, if Scaramouche gets this ability, it probably won't be called Riptide, but the reason I think it will carry over is because the Riptide symbol is incredibly similar to that of the Fatui. Therefore, I personally believe that this ability will carry over to the other Harbingers. I mean, we even get to see an Electro version of it during Tartaglia's boss fight, so we do know that it's possible with elements other than Hydro. But let's continue talking about Tartaglia's boss fight, since I believe that his Electro phase will be able to give us some hints at how Scaramouche might play, in particular his elemental skill. We've already established that Scaramouche probably isn't using a weapon that he's unfamiliar with, and so I don't think that his elemental skill will be like Tartaglia's and switch his weapon type. That's a bit of a shame because I love that aspect of Tartaglia, and I'd love to see some other characters get similar skills in the future. But I don't think that Scaramouche will be one of those characters. So let's look at some of Tartaglia's Electro attacks to see if Scaramouche's will be similar. Now, I don't think that any of his attacks will be exactly the same as Child's, but we can get elements from them to give a rough idea of what Scaramouche's attacks will be like. So first of all, he'll probably have very fast attacks. They'll also have to be different enough to Lisa, who shares the same vision and weapon, so I think a bigger focus on speed and manoeuvrability will be a good idea for him. Another thing that we can see from Tartaglia is how the Electro version of Riptide may function. Unlike the Hydro version, I don't think that it will simply deal bonus damage to the enemy upon hit. Instead, like we see in Tartaglia's boss fight, I think that Scaramouche will be able to make quick charged strikes upon enemies marked with the symbol. A bit like Keeching's Stiletto, but instead it marks enemies themselves rather than a place in the overworld. As for his burst, I'll be honest that I've got no clue. Obviously, if you have any ideas on what it could be, let us know down in the comments. I try to respond to as many as I can. But for his burst, I'd ideally want something which utilises his delusion element as well. But unfortunately, this probably isn't possible. After all, Tartaglia has no way to enter his foul legacy mode when you're playing as him, and also a delusion is shown to cause physical harm to the user. However, the fact that it damages the user hasn't stopped Mihoyo before. I mean, look at Xiao or Hu Tao. But since we didn't get to use Tartaglia's delusion, I still don't think that we'll be able to use Scaramouche's, which is a shame because a dual element character would be really unique to use. But that's all that I could think of for Scaramouche as a playable character. Of course, you may have your own ideas, probably much better than mine, so make sure to leave them in the comments. And lastly, while Scaramouche isn't confirmed to be playable yet, I really don't think that Mihoyo would leave him out. He's already become a fan favourite after all. But yeah, I think that's about it, so have a good one.